Howdy folks, welcome to our brand spanking new channel, Steampunk Desperado. I'm your host, Vaughn Troity, and I am the Steampunk Desperado. The purpose of this channel is to showcase that most fascinating and wonderful subgenre of science fiction known as steampunk. If you've never heard of steampunk, it's about time you did. It's a type of science fiction that deals not just with the future, but also with the past. You may have noticed some steampunk and not even been aware of it. There's a lot of folks dressing up in steampunk fashion in conventions like Comic-Con or maybe on the internet, like in Instagram or Facebook. If you see men dressed in dark suits and women in long elegant dresses, kind of Victorian aesthetic, they gotta be wearing hats usually. Men with bowler hats or cowboy hats like my own here. Women have often the very elaborate, fancy hats with flowers in them, just like in the old times. They'll have corsets or bustiers, perhaps a little racier than an authentically historical costume. But how this differs from real historical costuming is the fantasy sci-fi element. For example, the goggles. You have to have your goggles because you have to protect your eyes when you're driving your Stanley steamer or flying your airship. And gears are another popular construct because everything's mechanical. Everything's made out of cogs and wheels and clockwork. So if you see gears, think steampunk. And of course, there's the fantasy gadgets that can accompany your costume, such as this clockwork ray gun, which my wife Arliss made for me. And it's been a part of my costume since I started playing the Steampunk Desperado. Now, it's not just fashion, because where it started was the fiction. And to get to the beginnings of the steampunk movement, we have to go way back to the 1960s to a TV show that was on the CBS network called The Wild Wild West. That starred Robert Conrad and Ross Martin as two secret agents in the 1880s. They were kind of like cowboy James Bond types. It was one of my very favorite shows as a kid, second only to Star Trek, of course. And these guys helped protect the United States from all sorts of nefarious evildoers. They had their own gadgets, they had lots of different kinds of weapons. They had their very cool headquarters, which was one of my favorite things. They had their own train, which they could ride in, could sleep in, could store all their stuff in. And a lot of those villains were very colorful too, like Bond villains. They had their own inventions that were menacing, and stuff like the airplane being invented way before it really was invented. Now, we didn't have the word steampunk at the time, but later on, after the word was coined and we became fans of it, a lot of us looked back and said, hey, that really was steampunk because it was like a historical type of science fiction. This is just one aspect, however, because the word steampunk wasn't invented until the mid-1980s by a writer called K.W. Jeter. Now, he was a cyberpunk writer, and if you don't know what cyberpunk is, think Blade Runner. It's a type of sci-fi that deals with the future, near future sometimes, often far future, where there's been some really major changes to mankind or to society. And they're often dark and dystopian. Things like computers and clones and robots taking over the world. Anyway, Jeter was writing a story that was meant to be a sequel to H.G. Wells' A Time Machine. And it involved the Morlocks coming back from the future to eat people in Victorian London. Anyway, he coined this term steampunk, kind of as a joke, saying, what I'm writing is steampunk because it takes place in the age of steam, but I'm changing stuff. That's the punk element, where you change things up. And he meant it as kind of a joke, but the term stuck. And there were several other people that started writing in that vein at that time. My first exposure to steampunk was in 1980 with a book called The Difference Engine. A little closer here. This was written by a couple of other steampunk, well, not steampunk, but cyberpunk writers actually, William Gibson and Bruce Sterling. And the premise of the book was that the computer was invented 100 years early by a guy named Charles Babbage. Now that really did happen. He created this mechanical calculator made of gears and rods and pulleys and all these things back in the early 1800s. And the thing worked, but it wasn't a commercial success. But in the novel, it is a success, and it launches the computer revolution 100 years early with all the crazy and unpredictable changes to human society. I really enjoyed that book, and I started looking for other things in steampunk. But there weren't that many of them until the 2000s, when the boom really took off. One of the big writers at that time was Scott Westerfeld with a book called Leviathan about airships made from genetically engineered whales. And that's some real punking there, really changing the historical level of technology. But that was just one of many, many different types of steampunk novels that were coming out. And I classified the different types of steampunk because there were so many. We have to be able to keep track of them. First type, which is what I call the looking backward type. And the name is stolen from a novel by a guy named Edward Bellamy, who was writing back in the Victorian age about what he saw as the utopian future of the 20th century. And he got a lot of stuff, actually he got most of it wrong. And although I don't really consider that book steampunk because it's not all that exciting, it's mostly kind of a dry political treatise, it's a good term for anytime when a modern writer goes back into the Victorian era and he says, I'm going to pretend like I'm Edward Bellamy or whoever, and looking forward into the future and seeing what kind of amazing things that a Victorian might expect, that might be a totally alternate future to them than what we had in our time. My favorite example of this, and I will be reviewing this soon on the Steampunk Desperado channel, is a book by Michael Moorcock, very famous grandmaster of science fiction and fantasy, who also wrote a book called Warlord of the Air, in which a man from 1902 gets transported into the future of 1973 when the British Empire still rules the world, and there's no airplanes and there's great giant airships flying around, luxury airships for passengers, and then warships that are having air battles, hence the title Warlord of the Air. A lot of fun, and as I said, I'll be talking about that. Second kind is the alternate history, and I would definitely classify the Difference Engine in that, as well as the Wild Wild West, because it's more of a historical setting, just changed a little bit, just made different. Sometimes it might be something completely off the wall, like aliens invade the Wild West or Victorian London or Paris, France, something like that. But more often it's like technological advances that happened a little early. Of course, one of the favorite staples of steampunk is the airship. Even though airships weren't really common until probably around the 1920s, we will introduce them in the 1890s and having these elegant gentlemen and ladies riding around, sipping their tea and their brandy and smoking cigars and whatnot. Yes, they actually did have smoking on the Hindenburg, believe it or not. Maybe that was a bad idea. But anyway, back to the different genres of steampunk. Third type is what I call retrofuturism, which has nothing to do with the design school. It's a type of steampunk that happens in the future from us, that is, but when mankind, technology and whatever, society has regressed for whatever reason, perhaps a cataclysm, maybe a meteor, maybe climate change, and for that reason the technology is back to the age of steam. And that means that society also is typically rigidly class structured with more conservative mores. And a good example of that is a book by Philip Reeve called Mortal Engines. which is going to be made into a movie and released in December of this year, 2018. It's very exciting. I'm going to see that right away when it comes out, and I'll come back with you guys with a review and let you know all about it right here on the Steampunk Desperado channel. It takes place in the far future when cities have become mobile in order to survive. Looks pretty interesting. Fourth kind is what I call fantasy steampunk, and that is taking place in a world that never existed. That's become a lot more popular these days, perhaps so that people don't have to do a lot of historical research, just get a feel for it. One of the examples of that I have is this graphic novel called Lantern City. It takes place in a fictional place called Lantern City. And it's very dark, as you can see. The art style is dark. The story is dark and dystopian. And that is a society where these rich rulers run the city, and the workers have to slave away in the factories and the mines, and they're oppressed by the police that wear these pith helmets with goggles and gas masks, because you see a lot of gas masks in steampunk costuming for whatever reason. And so there's a rebellion. And so I'll be talking about that too at some time. Lantern City was slated to be a TV show, at least they were trying to get it to be a TV show. Unfortunately, it never happened. Now, I'm going to say one other type that isn't really a distinct type because it's another version of alternate history, but I'm going to say it anyway because this is the Steampunk Desperado channel, and that is Western steampunk, such as The Wild Wild West, or a book by a friend of mine called David Lee Summers. He's a fellow Southwesterner. It's basically a series about of clockwork tales from back in the Wild West with somewhat more diverse characters, like this Hispanic sheriff. Here is one of the primary protagonists. Pretty cool series. And this one by this strange author sitting right here. It's called Fidelios Automata. It's about a Cuban inventor who basically comes to the West to make his fortune, meets Nikola Tesla, gets involved in the Colorado Labor Wars, which really did happen, but he changes history a little bit with his mechanical spider beasts. Now, I will be doing a lot of these shows solo, but I will sometimes have guests, and the most frequent guest will be my wife, Arliss Holloway. She is my partner in crime and co-conspirator in the steampunk business. And we like to dress up in the steampunk fashion and go to conventions and so on. Again, like I said, she made my ray gun and helped me put together this costume. And we have written 2 more books together, which are, pardon me a second, Professor Ione D. and Her Adventures, a brilliant young female professor from the early 1900s who travels the world and has adventures. Very shocking and unusual for that day. I'd like to thank you for being with me on this introductory episode of Steampunk Desperado and taking some time from your busy day to talk about that wonderful, wonderful type of sci-fi called steampunk. We will be here for you week after week, bringing you news and reviews about steampunk, asking for your comments, asking for your recommendations of what to read and what to review. And please come back and see us again real soon. For now, though, this is Vaughn Troity, the Steampunk Desperado, saying adios amigos from the Steampunk Desperado channel, where the past meets the future and the present is extraordinary.